The ballroom doors slammed shut behind Alina Hartley, and for one terrible second she thought everyone had turned to stare at her. Her heart pounded so hard she could feel it in her throat. She had never worn a dress this fine before, and she had never stood in a room this grand, and she had never, not once in her life, expected the coldest man in the country to look directly at her and smile. His name was Julian Ashcombe, the Duke of Ravenswood, and every person in the room seemed to shrink a little when he walked past them. Alina had heard the stories long before she saw his face. They said he had never loved anyone. They said he broke promises the way other men broke bread, without a single thought. They said his own family feared him more than they respected him. Alina had believed none of it was her business, because a merchant's daughter like her would never be close enough to find out for herself. Yet here he was, walking straight toward her, past countesses and ladies who fanned themselves and whispered behind gloved hands, past men who bowed the second his eyes passed over them. He walked as though the room belonged to him, because in every sense that mattered it did. Alina tried to look away. She busied herself with her glass of lemon water, praying he would pass her by and choose someone else, anyone else, to torment with his attention. But he stopped in front of her, so close she could smell the faint scent of cedar and rain on his coat. "You are not supposed to be here," he said. His voice was calm, almost bored, but there was something sharp hiding underneath it, like a blade wrapped in silk. Alina lifted her chin. She refused to let him see her hands shake. "I was invited," she said, which was true, though only because her cousin Margaret had fallen ill and given Alina her invitation at the very last hour. "Invited," he repeated, as though tasting the word and finding it slightly unpleasant. "And yet I do not know your name, and I know the name of every single person who was meant to walk through those doors tonight." "Then perhaps your memory is not as perfect as everyone claims," Alina said before she could stop herself. For a moment the Duke said nothing. Around them the music swelled, violins climbing into a slow and aching waltz, and Alina was certain she had made a terrible mistake. Nobody spoke to the Duke of Ravenswood that way. Nobody dared. Then, to her shock, the corner of his mouth lifted. It was not quite a smile. It was something colder and far more dangerous, the look of a man who had just found something new to play with. "Alina Hartley," he said, and she startled because she had never told him her name. "Daughter of a cloth merchant, cousin to Margaret Hartley, who is home in bed with a fever tonight, which explains the borrowed invitation and the borrowed dress." Alina's stomach dropped. He had known her name the entire time. He had simply wanted to see what she would say. "You have been testing me," she said quietly, anger creeping into her voice now. "I test everyone," the Duke said simply. "Most people fail within the first sentence. You held out for 3. Alina should have walked away then. Every instinct told her to curtsy, apologize for nothing in particular, and disappear into the crowd before this man decided to make an example of her in front of the entire county. But something about the way he watched her, the way his dark eyes did not move from her face even when a duchess called his name from across the room, kept her rooted to the floor. "What do you want from me, Your Grace?" she asked. "A dance," he said, "one waltz." Alina almost laughed. "You barely know my name, and now you wish to dance with me." "I know your name, your family, and the amount your father owes to 3 different creditors in this city," the Duke said, and Alina's face went pale. "I make it my business to know things. It is how a man like me survives in a world full of people who would very much like to see him fall." "That does not answer my question." "No," he agreed, "it does not." He extended his hand, gloved in dark leather, and waited. "One waltz, Miss Hartley, that is all I am asking." Alina glanced around the room. People were beginning to notice now, whispers rippling outward like water disturbed by a stone. She knew that refusing him in front of all these people would humiliate her family, and accepting might humiliate her even more, because everyone would assume the Duke was mocking her, using her as a jest for his own entertainment. And perhaps he was, but there was something in his eyes that made her wonder if there was more to it than cruelty. She placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, warm despite the cold way he had spoken only moments before. He led her onto the floor, and the crowd parted for them the way water parts for a ship, silent and staring. Alina felt every eye in the room settle on her back, but strangely, once the music started and his hand found the small of her back, she forgot they were watching at all. He danced the way he spoke, precise and controlled, as though every step had been calculated in advance. Alina, who had only ever practiced this dance in her mother's small parlor with her father counting the beats aloud, found herself matching him without effort, as though her body understood something her mind had not yet caught up to. "You dance well for a merchant's daughter," the Duke said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "You insult well for a duke," Alina replied, and this time his smile was real, brief and startling, gone before she could be certain she had seen it at all. "Careful, Miss Hartley. Men have lost their heads for speaking to me the way you do." "Then I suppose I should be grateful you have not yet called for an executioner." "The night is young," he said, and though the words were cold, something in his tone made her stomach flutter in a way she did not entirely understand. They turned once, twice, 3 times around the floor, and Alina became aware of how close he held her, closer than propriety strictly allowed, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold hidden in the dark brown of his eyes. She told herself it meant nothing. Dukes danced with many women. This was simply his habit, his game, a way of reminding the room who held the power within it. "Tell me something true, Miss Hartley," he said as the music slowed. "Something no one else in this room knows about you." Alina hesitated. "I did not want to come tonight," she admitted. "I only came because my cousin begged me to use her invitation so it would not go to waste. I have spent the entire evening terrified someone would discover I do not belong here. And now I am dancing with the one man everyone warned me to avoid," she said. "So I suppose the evening has gone rather worse than I feared." The Duke laughed then, a short, surprised sound, as though laughter itself was unfamiliar to him. Several heads turned at the sound, clearly astonished. Alina felt a strange flush of pride at having caused it, quickly followed by confusion at why she should feel proud of anything at all where this man was concerned. The final notes of the waltz began to fade, violins slowing into silence, and Alina expected him to release her hand, offer a polite bow, and vanish into the crowd of admirers waiting for his attention. Instead, he kept her hand in his and turned to face the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, and his voice carried effortlessly across the hall, silencing every conversation at once. Alina's heart began to pound. "I would like to introduce you to Miss Alina Hartley. One waltz with me and a woman becomes my wife. That has always been my rule, has it not?" A ripple of gasps spread through the crowd. Somewhere near the back, a glass shattered against the floor. Alina stared at him, certain she had misheard. "Your Grace, I believe that is a joke in very poor taste," she whispered, forcing a smile onto her face for the benefit of the watching crowd, though her fingers had gone cold in his grip. "Do you think so?" he asked, and his expression gave nothing away. "It must be," Alina said. "Dukes do not marry merchants' daughters over a single dance. This is a game to you, a way to entertain yourself at my expense, and I would ask that you end it now, before my family becomes the subject of every drawing-room joke in the county." The Duke studied her for a long moment, and something flickered behind his eyes that Alina could not name. Then he released her hand, bowed with perfect, mocking politeness, and stepped back into the crowd of nobles who immediately swarmed him with questions. Alina stood alone in the middle of the dance floor, her cheeks burning, her mind spinning. Around her, whispers rose like smoke, and she caught fragments of them as she hurried toward the doors. "Did you hear what he said? Poor girl, she has no idea. He has done this before, though never quite like this. She will regret coming tonight." By the time Alina reached her carriage, her hands were shaking so badly she could hardly grip the door handle. She told herself it did not matter. He was known for cruelty, known for using people as amusements and discarding them the moment he grew bored. Tomorrow, she was certain, the entire ballroom would be laughing about the joke the Duke had played on the merchant's daughter, and by next week, no one would remember her name at all. She climbed into the carriage and pressed her forehead against the cool glass of the window as the horses pulled away from the grand house, its windows still blazing with light and music. She closed her eyes and told herself, again and again, that it had only been a game. But somewhere deep inside her, in a place she did not want to examine too closely, Alina Hartley knew that the Duke of Ravenswood did not seem like a man who played games without intending to win them. The carriage rattled over the cobblestones, carrying her away from the golden light of the ballroom and into the quiet dark of the city streets, and Alina Hartley had no way of knowing that her life had already changed forever. Sealed with nothing more than a single dance and 8 simple words she had been foolish enough to believe were only a joke. A loud knock on the front door shattered the quiet of the Hartley household before the sun had even finished rising. Alina, still in her nightclothes, ran down the narrow staircase with her heart hammering, certain something terrible had happened. Her mother, Margaret Hartley, reached the door first, her hands trembling as she pulled it open to find a tall man in fine livery standing on the step, holding a sealed envelope stamped with a crest Alina recognized instantly. It was the raven and crown of the House of Ashcombe. "For Miss Alina Hartley," the messenger said, his voice flat and official, as though delivering letters like this was nothing unusual to him at all. "By order of His Grace, the Duke of Ravenswood." Alina's stomach twisted into a knot. She took the envelope with fingers that did not feel entirely her own, and the messenger bowed once before turning and walking briskly back to a carriage waiting at the end of the street, its black paint gleaming even in the pale morning light. "What is it?" her mother asked, closing the door and pressing close to Alina's shoulder. "Alina, your face has gone white as chalk." "It is nothing," Alina said quickly, though her hands shook as she turned the envelope over. "A misunderstanding from last night, I am sure of it." She broke the seal and unfolded the thick paper inside. The words were written in a firm, elegant hand, the kind of handwriting that suggested a man who had never once doubted himself. "Miss Hartley, you danced with me last night, and you know the custom as well as anyone raised within 100 miles of Ravenswood Hall. One waltz, freely given and freely accepted, and a binding promise of marriage follows. This is no ordinary custom, invented for sport. It has been the law of my family for 4 generations, recognized by the courts of this county, and I have never once broken it. I do not intend to start with you. A contract accompanies this letter. My solicitor will call upon your father this afternoon to finalize the arrangements. I trust you will not embarrass either of our families by attempting to contest what has already been witnessed by nearly 200 guests. Julian Ashcombe, Duke of Ravenswood." Alina read the letter 3 times before the words truly settled into her mind. Her hands went cold, then hot, then cold again. She thought she might be sick. "Alina," her mother's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Alina, what does it say?" Alina could not speak. She simply held out the letter, watching as her mother's eyes moved across the page, growing wider with every line. By the time Margaret Hartley finished reading, her hand had risen to cover her mouth, and there were tears gathering at the corners of her eyes, though Alina could not tell if they were tears of horror or something else entirely. "Mother," Alina whispered, "this cannot be real. Tell me this cannot be real." "The custom is real," her mother said quietly. "I have heard of it before, though I never believed anyone still honored such an old and strange tradition. The Ashcombe family has always been peculiar in their ways. They say the first Duke made the rule himself, after his own bride was stolen away by another man before their wedding day. He decreed that any woman who danced a waltz with the Duke of Ravenswood, and did not refuse before the music ended, would be considered promised to him, in the eyes of both his family and the courts." "I did not know," Alina said, her voice rising with panic. "How could I have known such a thing? No one ever told me. I would never have accepted his hand if I had understood what it meant." "I believe you," her mother said gently, though her eyes were distant, calculating something Alina could not yet follow. "But belief will not undo what has been done. 200 witnesses saw you dance with him. 200 witnesses heard him announce it in front of the entire room. If you refuse now, the Ashcombe family has the right, under the old contracts, to bring the matter before the county court. And I promise you, Eleanor, no judge in this land would rule against a duke. Eleanor sank onto the bottom step of the staircase, her legs suddenly unable to hold her weight. She pressed the letter against her chest as though she could somehow crush the words within it, make them disappear, undo the entire evening and wake up somewhere else, in some other life where she had never borrowed her cousin's invitation at all. "This is a punishment," she said quietly. "He is punishing me for speaking to him the way I did, for not bowing my head and agreeing with everything he said. He wants to make an example of me, to show the entire county what happens to a woman who dares to challenge him." "Perhaps," her mother said, "or perhaps he simply intends to keep the promise his family has kept for generations, regardless of what it costs anyone involved." Eleanor's father, Henry Hartley, appeared at the top of the stairs, still fastening his shirt, his face creased with confusion at the commotion below. When Margaret explained what had happened, handing him the letter, Eleanor watched something shift in her father's expression that frightened her more than anything the Duke himself had said the night before. It was not horror, it was hope. "Father," Eleanor said carefully, "you cannot possibly think this is good news." "Eleanor," her father said, choosing his words slowly, the way he always did when discussing something that troubled him. "You know our situation. You know what we owe and to whom, and how little time remains before the debts come due. I am not saying this arrangement pleases me. I am saying that a marriage to the Duke of Ravenswood would settle every debt we carry, and more besides. It would secure your sister's futures as well as your own." "You would sell me to a man everyone in this county fears," Eleanor said, her voice breaking, "simply because it solves your money troubles." "I would never force you into anything," her father said quickly, though there was a note of desperation beneath his words that Eleanor recognized all too well. "But your mother is right. If we refuse and the matter goes before the courts, we will lose regardless. At least if we accept on our own terms, rather than terms forced upon us by a judge who has likely dined at Ravenswood Hall a dozen times." Eleanor buried her face in her hands. The morning light streaming through the front windows suddenly felt too bright, too harsh, exposing every crack in the life she had known only hours before. Later that afternoon, exactly as the letter had promised, a solicitor arrived at the Hartley home dressed in a coat far finer than anything Eleanor's father owned. He carried a leather case filled with documents, and he spoke in the calm, unhurried tone of a man who had delivered difficult news to many families before and expected no resistance from this one. He laid out the terms of the contract on the dining table, and Eleanor stood at the edge of the room, arms crossed tightly over her chest, listening as her entire future was discussed as though she were a piece of property changing hands. The wedding, the solicitor explained, would take place within 1 month, in keeping with the old Ashcombe tradition that no promised match should be allowed to linger unresolved. Eleanor's father's debts, all of them, down to the smallest unpaid tailor's bill, would be settled in full the moment the contract was signed. Eleanor herself would receive an allowance befitting a duchess, and her sisters would each receive a dowry sufficient to secure respectable marriages of their own. "And if I refuse?" Eleanor asked, stepping forward for the first time since the solicitor had arrived. The man looked at her with something close to pity. "Miss Hartley, I would strongly advise against refusal. The custom has been tested in court twice in the past 30 years, and both times the ruling favored the Ashcombe family. Refusal would not release you from the obligation. It would simply mean facing the same outcome. After a great deal of public embarrassment and legal expense your family cannot afford." Eleanor felt the walls of the room pressing closer, the weight of the entire situation settling onto her shoulders like a physical thing. She thought of the Duke's cold eyes, his mocking smile, the way he had announced her name to the entire ballroom as though she were nothing more than a prize he had won at cards. She thought of her sisters, still young, still hopeful about their own futures, and how easily those futures could be destroyed by a scandal neither of them had caused. "I need time to think," Elinor said quietly. "You have until tomorrow morning," the solicitor said, gathering his papers back into the leather case. "His Grace is not a patient man." That night Elinor could not sleep. She sat by her bedroom window, staring out at the dark street below, replaying every moment of the ballroom in her mind. She remembered the warmth of his hand at her back, the surprising sound of his laughter, the flicker of something unreadable in his eyes when she had called his proposal a joke. She wondered, not for the first time, whether the cruelty everyone spoke of was truly all there was to Julian Ashcombe, or whether it was simply the mask a man wore when the world expected nothing gentler from him. She thought of refusing. She imagined standing before a judge, insisting she owed this man nothing, that a single dance did not make a promise, that no century-old custom should be allowed to decide the course of her entire life. But she also thought of her father's face, worn thin with worry, and her mother's carefully hidden hope, and her sister's bright, unsuspecting futures hanging in the balance. By the time the first gray light of morning touched her window, Elinor Hartley had made her decision, though it settled in her chest like a stone rather than a relief. She would not run from this. She would not let herself be crushed beneath it either. If she was going to be forced into this marriage, she would walk into it with her eyes open, and she would make certain that Julian Ashcombe understood, from the very first day, that she was not a woman who could simply be won and then forgotten. She dressed carefully that morning, choosing her plainest gown, the one that owed nothing to borrowed finery or ballroom illusions. When the solicitor returned at midday to collect her answer, Elinor met him at the door herself, her chin lifted, her voice steady despite the storm raging beneath her calm exterior. "Tell the Duke," she said, "that I accept his contract. But tell him also that I expect him to honor every word of it, exactly as written, because I intend to hold him to his promises just as tightly as he intends to hold me to mine." The solicitor studied her for a long moment, something like surprise crossing his usually unreadable face. Then he bowed, gathered his papers, and left without another word, and Elinor closed the door behind him, leaning against it as her legs finally gave way beneath her. Somewhere across the city, in a grand house she had visited only once, Julian Ashcombe read her answer with an expression none of his servants could quite interpret. He set the letter down on his desk, walked to the window overlooking his vast, silent gardens, and allowed himself, for the first time since his father's death, a small and private smile that had nothing to do with cruelty at all. The carriage that carried Elinor to Ravenswood Hall for the first time moved slower than she wanted, and faster than she was ready for, both at once. She pressed her gloved hands together in her lap, watching the city give way to open fields, then to tall iron gates that groaned open at the approach of the ducal crest painted on the carriage door. Beyond the gates, a long gravel drive stretched toward a house so large that Elinor's childhood home could have fit inside its entrance hall alone. Julian was waiting on the front steps when the carriage rolled to a stop. He wore no coat, only a simple dark waistcoat, his sleeves rolled to the elbow as though he had been interrupted in the middle of some private task. He looked less like the cold, commanding figure from the ballroom, and more like an ordinary man standing in front of an extraordinary house, and for one brief, dangerous moment, Elinor almost forgot to be afraid of him. "Miss Hartley," he said, offering his hand as she stepped down from the carriage. "You came." "You gave me little choice," Elinor said, refusing his hand and gathering her skirts instead as she stepped onto the gravel herself. Something flickered across his face, gone before she could name it. "No," he admitted. "I suppose I did not." He led her inside, and Elinor tried not to let her astonishment show as they passed through hallways lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors, rooms filled with furniture that likely cost more than her father earned in a decade, and windows so tall they seemed to invite the entire sky indoors. Servants bowed as they passed, their eyes darting curiously toward Elinor, clearly having already heard the story of the merchant's daughter who had danced her way into a duchy. "I have asked the housekeeper to prepare rooms for you," Julian said as they walked. "You will have your own quarters, separate from mine in the east wing. I understand this arrangement is not one you chose freely, and I do not intend to make it worse than it already is by forcing familiarity upon you. Alina glanced at him, surprised by the offer. That is considerate of you, your grace. Do not mistake consideration for kindness, he said, his voice returning to its familiar coolness. I simply see no benefit in cruelty where none is required. And where cruelty is required? Alina asked, unable to stop herself. The corner of his mouth twitched, though whether in amusement or irritation, she could not tell. Then I suppose you will see exactly why the county fears me. They reached a set of tall doors leading into a private study, and Julian gestured for her to enter. Inside, a fire crackled in a wide stone hearth, and shelves of books climbed the walls from floor to ceiling. It was, Alina thought, the first room in the entire house that seemed to belong to a real person rather than a museum of ancestral wealth. Sit, Julian said, though it came out less like a command and more like an invitation, softened just slightly at the edges. Alina sat, and he took the chair across from her, studying her with the same careful attention he had shown at the ball, as though she were a puzzle he had not yet fully solved. I imagine you have questions, he said. I have many, Alina said, but I suppose the most pressing one is this. Why me? You could have chosen any woman in that room to torment with your family's strange old custom. Why choose a merchant's daughter, who had no business being there in the first place? Julian was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the fire rather than on her. My father died 6 months ago, he said finally. Before he passed, he left a condition in his will. I must marry within 1 year of his death, or the estate, along with the title, passes to my cousin Edmund, a man who has spent the last decade draining every fortune he has ever touched and would ruin this family within a decade if given the chance. Alina frowned. That still does not explain why you chose me. Every eligible woman in that room came from a family with connections, ambitions, and expectations, Julian said. Marry one of them, and I inherit not only a wife, but an entire network of relatives eager to insert themselves into my affairs, my decisions, my very household. I have spent my whole life surrounded by people who want something from me. I did not wish to spend the rest of it the same way. So you chose someone with no power, Alina said slowly, understanding dawning cold and sharp in her chest. Someone who could not fight back. Someone whose family would be too desperate for money to refuse, no matter how unfair the arrangement. Yes, Julian said, meeting her eyes without flinching. That is precisely what I did. Alina stood so quickly her chair scraped against the polished floor. At least you are honest, she said, her voice trembling with anger she had been holding back since the moment she read his letter. Most men would have dressed that cruelty in pretty words, told me I was chosen for my wit, or my courage, or some other flattering lie. You simply admit that I was convenient. Would you have preferred the lie? Julian asked, rising as well, though he made no move toward her. I would have preferred not to be a solution to your inheritance problem at all, Alina snapped. I would have preferred to marry, if I ever married, a man who chose me because he wanted me, not because I was the easiest woman in the room to trap. Something shifted in Julian's expression, a flicker of something that might have been regret, though it vanished as quickly as it appeared. I did not say I regretted the choice, he said quietly, only that I understood from the very beginning exactly what I was doing. Alina stared at him, unsure whether his words were meant to comfort her or simply to further unsettle her. You are a strange man, your grace. I have been told worse, he said, and there was the faintest trace of humor in his voice now, enough to make Alina's anger falter, though only slightly. Before she could respond, the study door opened without warning, and a young woman swept inside, dressed in silk far too fine for an ordinary afternoon visit, her golden hair arranged in perfect, careful curls. She stopped short at the sight of Alina, her eyes narrowing with obvious displeasure. Julian, the woman said, ignoring Alina entirely. I heard the most absurd rumor in town this morning, something about a merchant's daughter and a waltz. Please tell me it is not true. Charlotte, Julian said, his voice suddenly flat and formal, all traces of warmth gone. This is Eleanor Hartley, my intended. Eleanor, this is Lady Charlotte Winslow, a family friend. Charlotte's gaze swept over Eleanor from head to toe, taking in every detail of her plain gown, her unpowdered hair, her lack of jewels, with an expression of barely concealed contempt. A family friend, Charlotte repeated, her voice tight. How generous of you to describe our history in such simple terms. Charlotte, Julian warned. No, it is quite all right, Charlotte said, though her smile did not reach her eyes. Miss Hartley, I do hope you understand what you have agreed to. Julian's family has ruined more hopeful young women than you can imagine. I would hate for you to become another one of his forgotten arrangements. Eleanor felt her cheeks burn, but she refused to let the other woman see her flinch. I appreciate your concern, Lady Charlotte, she said, keeping her voice steady, though I believe I am capable of managing my own arrangements without assistance. Charlotte's eyes flashed with something dangerous, quickly hidden behind a practiced, polite smile. Of course, she said. Julian, we must speak, privately. Whatever you have to say, you may say in front of Eleanor, Julian said. She will be my wife within the month. There is little point in secrets now. Charlotte's composure cracked, just for a moment, before she smoothed it back into place. Very well, she said coldly. I simply came to remind you that your father's memorial service is in 2 weeks, and the family expects you to attend with someone suitable. Eleanor will attend with me, Julian said. There is no one more suitable, since she will soon carry my name. Charlotte's jaw tightened, and without another word, she turned and swept out of the room, her silk skirts hissing against the floor. Eleanor watched her go, her mind spinning with questions she was not yet brave enough to ask. She does not approve of me, Eleanor said once the door had closed. She does not approve of anyone who threatens what she believes is owed to her, Julian said, his voice tired in a way Eleanor had not heard from him before. Charlotte and I were expected to marry once, before my father changed his mind about which family alliances would benefit the estate most. She has never forgiven either of us for it. And do you still care for her? Eleanor asked, surprising herself with the question. Julian looked at her for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his eyes. I care for very few people, Miss Hartley, he said finally. Charlotte is not among them, though she has not yet accepted that truth. Eleanor did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing at all. The fire crackled in the silence between them, and outside the tall windows, gray clouds began to gather over the vast gardens of Ravenswood Hall. You should return home before the weather turns, Julian said eventually, his voice returning to its familiar, distant formality. I will send the carriage. We will speak again before the wedding to finalize the remaining details. Eleanor nodded, rising from her chair, though she found herself hesitating at the door, glancing back at him one last time. He stood by the fire, his shoulders set in the same rigid posture she remembered from the ballroom. And yet something about him seemed smaller now, more human, than the cold and calculating Duke everyone whispered about in fearful tones. Your Grace, she said quietly, for what it is worth, I do not think you are as cruel as everyone believes you to be. Julian's eyes met hers, startled by the sudden gentleness in her voice. You have known me for less than 2 days, Miss Hartley, he said. I would not be so quick to form conclusions. Perhaps not, Eleanor said. But I have learned that people rarely explain their cruelty so honestly unless they are hiding something far more complicated underneath it. She did not wait for his response. She turned and left the study, walking back through the grand, echoing halls of Ravenswood Hall with her heart pounding in a way that had nothing to do with fear, and everything to do with the unsettling realization that the man she had been dreading to marry might not be quite the monster the entire county believed him to be. The carriage ride home felt shorter than the journey there, though Eleanor barely noticed the passing fields, her mind replaying every word Julian had spoken, every flicker of emotion he had failed to fully hide. She thought of Charlotte's warning, of the strange history clearly buried between the two of them, and of the will that had forced Julian into this arrangement just as surely as poverty had forced her family into accepting it. By the time she arrived home, Alina had made a quiet decision, one she did not share with her parents that evening, nor with anyone else. She would not simply survive this marriage, enduring it as a punishment to be tolerated until it inevitably grew unbearable. She would understand it. She would understand him, this cold and calculating duke who spoke honestly about his own cruelty, and yet flinched, however briefly, at the mention of a woman from his past. Whatever waited for her at Ravenswood Hall, Alina hardly intended to walk into it with her eyes wide open, and her heart, however cautiously, ready to learn the truth. The wedding day arrived faster than Alina felt prepared for, though in truth, no amount of time would have made her feel ready to stand before a small chapel packed with strangers and promise her life to a man she barely knew. The chapel at Ravenswood belonged to the family alone, a stone building older than the great house itself, its narrow windows filled with colored glass that scattered soft light across the aisle where Alina now stood, her hand trembling slightly on her father's arm. Julian waited at the altar, dressed in dark formal clothes that made him look even taller and more severe than usual. His face gave nothing away, not joy, not reluctance, simply the same careful, guarded expression Alina had come to expect from him. She wondered, walking toward him, whether he felt anything at all beneath that composure, or whether years of practice had trained every true emotion out of him long before she had ever entered his life. The ceremony itself passed in a blur of unfamiliar words and cold stone air. Alina spoke her vows in a steady voice that surprised even herself, and when Julian took her hand to slide a ring onto her finger, his fingers were warmer than she expected, though his eyes remained distant, fixed somewhere just past her shoulder rather than on her face. When the priest finally pronounced them husband and wife, a polite ripple of applause moved through the small crowd of guests, though Alina noticed few genuine smiles among them. Most of the attendees were Julian's relatives and associates, people who studied her with open curiosity, clearly trying to determine what a merchant's daughter could possibly offer their illustrious family beyond a strange twist of custom and circumstance. Charlotte sat near the front, her expression carefully composed into polite interest, though Alina caught the tightness around her eyes, the way her hands remained clenched in her lap throughout the entire ceremony. Alina chose not to dwell on it. She had enough to manage without adding Charlotte's resentment to the growing list of burdens she now carried. The wedding breakfast that followed was a stiff, formal affair, held in the grand dining hall beneath portraits of long-dead Ashcombe ancestors, who seemed to watch the proceedings with the same cool detachment as their living descendant. Alina sat beside Julian at the head of the long table, exchanging polite, meaningless conversation with guests she would likely never see again, while Julian responded to congratulations with brief, practiced replies that revealed nothing of his true feelings. It was not until the guests had finally departed, and the great house settled into the quiet hush of early evening, that Alina found herself alone with her new husband for the first time since their wedding vows. They stood in the same study where they had first spoken honestly to one another, the fire once again crackling in the hearth, though the silence between them now felt heavier, charged with the weight of everything that had changed and everything that had not. "I believe it is customary," Julian said finally, breaking the silence, "for a husband to say something meaningful to his wife on their wedding night." "Do you have something meaningful to say?" Alina asked, watching him carefully. "I have terms," Julian said, and Alina felt a flicker of disappointment she did not fully understand, quickly buried beneath practical curiosity. "Then let us hear them." Julian moved to his desk and retrieved a folded paper, handing it to her without ceremony. "I have drawn up an agreement," he said. "It outlines the arrangement between us. You will have complete control over your own allowance without requiring my approval for any purchase or decision. You will have your own quarters, as I promised, and I will not enter them without your invitation. In matters of household management, your word will carry the same weight as mine. In exchange, I ask only that you maintain the appearance of a proper marriage in public, for the sake of both our families' reputations." Alina unfolded the paper and scanned the careful, precise handwriting, each term laid out as clearly and coldly as a business contract. In a strange way, she found the formality reassuring. There were no false declarations of affection here, no pretense of a love neither of them felt. Just an honest arrangement between two people bound together by circumstances beyond their control. "These terms seem generous," she said slowly, looking up at him. "Unusually so, for a man who admitted he chose me simply because I was convenient." "Convenient does not mean I intend to be cruel," Julian said. "I told you once, I see no benefit in cruelty where none is required. You did not ask for this marriage. I see no reason to make your life within it any smaller than it must be." Alina studied him for a long moment, searching his face for the mockery she had expected to find there, the hidden trap beneath his generosity. She found none. "I have one addition," she said finally. Julian raised an eyebrow, clearly not expecting resistance. "Go on." "I wish to continue visiting my family," Alina said. "Regularly, and without requiring your permission each time. And I wish to have some purpose here beyond simply existing as your wife in name. I do not intend to spend the rest of my life wandering empty hallways with nothing to occupy my mind." For the first time since the wedding began, something like genuine respect flickered across Julian's face. "Both requests are reasonable," he said. "I will have the housekeeper show you the estate ledgers tomorrow if you wish to involve yourself in the household accounts. My mother, before she passed, managed a great deal of the estate's charitable work in the surrounding villages. That responsibility has gone neglected since her death. Perhaps you would find it worthwhile." Alina felt a small, unexpected warmth at the offer, quickly followed by suspicion. "Why are you being so accommodating, Your Grace? Only days ago, you spoke of me as though I were simply a convenient solution to your inheritance troubles." "I'm not accommodating out of guilt, if that is what you are suggesting," Julian said, his voice cooling slightly. "I am accommodating because a wife who resents her circumstances entirely is far more troublesome than one who has some measure of contentment within them. Call it practicality, if you prefer, rather than kindness." "You seem determined to avoid the word kindness at every opportunity," Alina observed. "Kindness is a weakness men exploit," Julian said, his tone suddenly sharp, betraying something raw beneath the careful control he usually maintained. "I learned that lesson a very long time ago, and I do not intend to relearn it." Alina wanted to ask what had taught him such a bitter lesson, wanted to press further into the shadows clearly hiding behind his cold exterior, but something in his expression warned her against it, at least for tonight. Instead, she folded the contract carefully and tucked it into her sleeve. "Very well," she said. "I accept your terms, with my additions included." Julian nodded once, as though a business matter had been satisfactorily concluded, and for a moment, Alina felt the strange sting of disappointment again, though she could not quite name why a formal contract should feel like anything other than exactly what it was. "Good night, Alina," Julian said, using her given name for the first time since they had met. "Good night, Julian," she replied, testing the sound of his name on her own tongue, and something in his expression shifted, softened almost imperceptibly, before he turned back toward the fire and said nothing more. Alina made her way to her new quarters in the East Wing, a suite of rooms larger than her entire childhood home, decorated in soft blues and creams that felt strangely calming after the tension of the day. She sat by the window for a long while, looking out over the moonlit gardens, thinking of everything that had happened in the span of a single month. A borrowed invitation, a single dance. A binding promise she had never truly agreed to. And yet here she was, a duchess now, married to a man whose cruelty seemed to hide something far more wounded than anyone in the county suspected. Over the following days, Alina threw herself into her new responsibilities with a determination that surprised even her. She met with the housekeeper each morning, learning the intricate workings of the vast estate, the names of every servant, the schedules that kept the great house running smoothly behind its polished facade. She reviewed her late mother-in-law's charitable ledgers and began planning visits to the surrounding villages, determined to continue the work that had clearly meant a great deal to a woman she had never met. Julian, for his part, remained largely distant during those first weeks, occupied with a state business that kept him away from the house for long hours each day. Yet Alina noticed small things, quiet gestures that contradicted the cold reputation everyone insisted upon. A book left on her desk, one she had mentioned enjoying during a brief conversation weeks before. Instructions given to the kitchen staff to prepare her favorite dishes, though she had never directly requested them. A carriage arranged for her weekly visits to her family without her ever having to ask. She began to understand, slowly and cautiously, that Julian Ashcombe expressed care not through words, which he seemed to distrust entirely, but through small, deliberate actions that asked for nothing in return. It was a strange kind of language, one Alina found herself learning to read with growing fascination, even as she reminded herself, again and again, not to mistake careful consideration for anything deeper. One evening, nearly 3 weeks into their marriage, Alina found Julian in the study later than usual, staring into the dying embers of the fire with an expression of such profound exhaustion that she nearly turned and left without disturbing him. Instead, she stepped inside and settled quietly into the chair across from his. "You work too hard," she said gently. "There is a great deal that requires attention," Julian said, not looking up. "My father left the estate in worse condition than anyone realized. I have spent every day since his death trying to prevent it from collapsing entirely." "You never mentioned that," Alina said, surprised. "There was little reason to," Julian said. "It is not your burden to carry." "We are married now," Alina said carefully. "Perhaps it is exactly my burden to carry, at least in part, if you would allow it." Julian finally looked up, studying her with an expression she could not quite decipher, somewhere between surprise and something warmer, something he seemed determined to suppress before it could fully surface. "You continue to surprise me, Alina Hartley," he said quietly. "Ashcombe," Alina corrected softly. "I believe that is my name now." Something shifted in his face at that, subtle but unmistakable, and for the first time since their wedding day, Julian offered her a smile that held no trace of mockery or cold calculation at all, only something tentative and unguarded, quickly hidden again behind his familiar composure, though not quite quickly enough for Alina to miss it entirely. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm neither of them had expected, quiet and steady in a way that felt almost fragile, as though either of them might shatter it with a single careless word. Alina spent her mornings among the estate ledgers, learning the details of debts her husband had inherited alongside his title, and her afternoons visiting the villages scattered across Ravenswood land, where tenant families greeted her with a mixture of curiosity and cautious warmth. It was during one of these visits that Alina first truly understood the depth of what Julian carried alone. She had stopped at a small cottage near the eastern edge of the estate, where an elderly widow named Agnes lived with her 2 grandchildren, their father lost to illness the previous winter. Agnes spoke freely, the way people often do with strangers who seem unlikely to repeat their words, and she told Alina stories of the old Duke, Julian's father, a man remembered not with the fondness Alina had expected, but with a quiet, careful fear that lingered even in memory. "He was not a gentle man, that one," Agnes said, kneading dough at her worn wooden table while her grandchildren played near the hearth. "Cold as winter stone, and twice as hard on his own boy as he ever was on the rest of us. I remember young Julian, no older than my grandson there, standing out in the rain because his father decided a duke's heir should learn to endure hardship without complaint. Broke my heart to see it, though there was nothing any of us could do." Alina listened, her chest tightening with something between grief and understanding, pieces of Julian's careful, guarded nature slowly beginning to arrange themselves into a clearer picture. She thought of his sharp words about kindness being a weakness men exploit, and wondered now whether those words had first been spoken to him, long before he ever spoke them to her. "He does not seem cold to me," Alina said quietly, almost to herself. Agnes glanced up, studying her with knowing eyes. "Perhaps you are simply the first person patient enough to look past it, my lady," she said. "That boy learned early that showing his heart only gave his father another place to strike. Some habits, once learned that young, take a lifetime to unlearn if they can be unlearned at all. Alina returned to Ravenswood Hall that evening with Agnes's words echoing in her mind, and when she found Julian in his study, poring over yet another stack of estate documents, she found herself studying him with new eyes, searching for the frightened boy hidden somewhere beneath the composed, guarded man he had become. "You are staring," Julian said, without looking up from his papers. "I visited Agnes Whitfield's cottage today," Alina said carefully. "She spoke of your father." Julian's pen stilled against the paper, though he still did not look up. "People enjoy speaking of the dead," he said. "It costs them nothing, and often earns them sympathy." "She spoke of you as well," Alina continued gently. "Of a boy left standing in the rain, learning lessons no child should have to learn." Julian set down his pen slowly, finally meeting her eyes, and for a moment the careful mask he wore so consistently seemed to crack entirely, revealing something raw and unguarded underneath. "My father believed weakness was a disease that spread through gentleness," he said, his voice quieter than Alina had ever heard it. "He believed the only way to raise a man capable of holding this estate together was to strip away every soft thing in him before the world could use it against him." "And did it work?" Alina asked softly. "I do not know," Julian admitted, and the honesty in his voice struck Alina harder than any of his sharp remarks ever had. "I have spent so long building walls that I sometimes wonder if there is anything left behind them worth protecting." Alina rose from her chair and crossed the room, kneeling beside his desk so that she could look directly into his eyes rather than across the space between them. "I do not believe that," she said firmly. "I have seen the books you leave for me, the dishes prepared without my asking, the carriage arranged each week without complaint. Those are not the actions of a man with nothing left inside him, Julian. Those are the actions of a man who has simply forgotten how to say the gentle things out loud." Julian stared at her, something vulnerable and searching in his expression, as though he wanted desperately to believe her words but did not quite trust himself to accept them. "You are the first person to say such things to me since my mother died," he said quietly. "Then perhaps it is time someone said them again," Alina replied. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the fire crackling softly in the silence between them, something unspoken and fragile beginning to take shape in the space where cold formality had once stood. Alina did not know exactly when her feelings toward this complicated, guarded man had shifted from wary tolerance into something warmer, something she was not yet ready to name even to herself. But sitting there beside him, watching the careful walls around his heart begin to show their first small cracks, she understood that whatever this marriage had started as, it was quickly becoming something else entirely. Their days grew easier after that evening, the distance between them narrowing bit by bit. Julian began joining Alina for breakfast each morning instead of eating alone in his study, and their conversations, once stiff and formal, grew easy and unguarded, filled with quiet laughter that surprised the household staff nearly as much as it surprised Alina herself. He began asking her opinion on estate matters, listening genuinely to her suggestions rather than simply tolerating them, and Alina found herself looking forward to these moments, with an eagerness she had not expected to feel toward the man she had once believed intended only to humiliate her. One afternoon, nearly 2 months into their marriage, Julian found Alina in the estate gardens, kneeling in the dirt beside the roses his mother had once tended, her sleeves rolled up despite the mud staining the fabric. "A duchess gardening with her own hands," Julian said, amusement clear in his voice as he approached. "Charlotte would be horrified." "Charlotte is horrified by a great many things about me," Alina said, laughing despite herself. "I have made my peace with disappointing her." Julian knelt beside her, unexpectedly, and began pulling weeds from the flower bed with the same careful attention he brought to his estate ledgers. "My mother planted these roses the year I was born," he said quietly. "I have not tended them properly since she died. I did not trust myself to care for something so easily broken." "They are not so easily broken as you think," Alina said, glancing at him. "Roses are stronger than people give them credit for. They simply need someone patient enough to care for them properly." Julian looked at her then, something warm and unguarded in his gaze that made Aline's heart quicken in a way she was no longer trying to deny. "I am beginning to think the same might be true of certain people as well," he said softly. Aline felt her cheeks warm, and she looked away, focusing on the roses rather than the intensity of his gaze, though her heart continued its unsteady rhythm long after the moment had passed. She was beginning to understand, slowly and against every instinct that had warned her away from this marriage in the first place, that the cruel duke everyone feared had never truly existed at all, not in the way the county believed. What existed instead was a man shaped by cruelty he had never chosen, carefully rebuilding himself, piece by careful piece, in the quiet garden of a marriage neither of them had wanted, but both perhaps were beginning to need. That evening, as the sun set golden over the estate grounds, Julian invited Aline to walk with him along the garden paths his mother had once loved. And as they walked in comfortable silence, their hands brushed once then again, until finally, without a word spoken between them, Julian's fingers laced gently through hers, and Aline did not pull away. It was a small thing, a simple touch shared between two people still learning the shape of whatever this marriage was becoming. But it felt, to Aline, like the first true promise either of them had made since that fateful waltz that had started everything, a promise made not out of custom or contract, but out of something far more fragile and far more real. News of the growing warmth between the Duke and his new wife spread through the county faster than either of them expected, carried by servants' quiet gossip and the observations of guests who visited Ravenswood Hall on estate business. Most of the county seemed pleased by the change, relieved to see the notoriously cold Duke softened by his unexpected marriage, but not everyone welcomed the transformation with equal warmth. Charlotte Winslow arrived at Ravenswood unannounced on a gray autumn afternoon, her carriage rattling up the long drive with an urgency that immediately put the household staff on edge. Aline was in the study reviewing the week's estate accounts when a servant announced Charlotte's arrival, and something in the woman's tone suggested this was not a friendly social call. "Send her in," Aline said, setting aside her papers, though her stomach tightened with unease. Charlotte swept into the room dressed in deep green silk, her expression carefully arranged into polite concern, though Aline had learned enough of her true nature during the wedding to recognize the calculation hiding beneath it. "Aline," Charlotte said, using her given name for the first time, which struck Aline as more unsettling than any formal address could have been. "I do hope I am not intruding." "Not at all," Aline said carefully. "Julian is out inspecting the eastern fields, if you have come to see him." "Actually," Charlotte said, settling herself into a chair without waiting for an invitation, "I came to see you. I felt it only fair to warn you, woman to woman, before matters grow any more complicated than they already are." Aline's unease deepened. "Warn me of what exactly?" Charlotte's smile turned sharp at the edges. "There are people in this county, Aline, who remember quite clearly that you arrived at that ball using a borrowed invitation, under circumstances that were never entirely honest to begin with. I wonder how the courts might view the legitimacy of your marriage, should certain questions be raised about the true nature of your invitation that night." Aline's blood ran cold, though she forced her expression to remain steady. "My cousin gave me her invitation because she was ill. There was nothing dishonest about it." "Perhaps not," Charlotte said, examining her gloved fingers with studied casualness. "But perception matters a great deal more than truth in circles such as ours, does it not? Imagine the scandal, should whispers begin suggesting that Aline Hartley schemed her way into that ballroom specifically to catch a duke's attention. Imagine how quickly Julian's family and associates might turn against a marriage built on such uncertain foundations." "You are threatening me," Aline said, her voice low and steady despite the fear building in her chest. "I am simply reminding you of realities," Charlotte said, rising gracefully from her chair. "Julian was promised to me once, long before you ever stepped foot in that ballroom. I do not intend to watch quietly while a merchant's daughter plays at being a duchess, especially not when there remain such convenient questions about how she secured that position in the first place." Charlotte left as quickly as she had arrived, her carriage disappearing down the long drive in a cloud of autumn dust, and Alina remained standing in the study for a long while afterward, her mind racing through every possible consequence of Charlotte's veiled threat. She thought of her family, finally free from the crushing debts that had haunted them for years, and how quickly that freedom could be stripped away if scandal forced an annulment. She thought of the fragile warmth that had grown between herself and Julian, and how easily suspicion and public shame could crush something so newly formed. She said nothing to Julian that evening, uncertain whether raising the matter would help or simply add unnecessary worry to his already burdened shoulders. But over the following days, Alina began noticing subtle changes in how certain acquaintances treated her during her village visits, a coolness in their greetings, whispered conversations that ceased abruptly when she drew near. Charlotte, it seemed, had wasted no time spreading her carefully planted seeds of doubt. Matters came to a head nearly 2 weeks later, when Julian returned from a trip into town with an expression darker than Alina had seen since the earliest days of their marriage. He found her in the garden, tending the roses that had become something of a shared ritual between them, and his voice, when he finally spoke, carried an edge of barely controlled anger. "There are rumors circulating through town," he said without preamble, "suggesting you deliberately arranged to attend that ball with the specific intention of trapping me into marriage. Some are even suggesting the entire Waltz custom was known to you beforehand, and that you used it quite deliberately to secure your family's financial security." Alina felt her heart drop, though she forced herself to remain calm. "Julian, I swear to you, I had no knowledge of that custom before your letter arrived the following morning. My cousin fell ill and gave me her invitation only hours before the ball began. I never intended any of this." "I want to believe you," Julian said, his voice strained. "But these rumors did not appear from nothing, Alina. Someone with detailed knowledge of our private circumstances has been speaking against you quite deliberately, and I intend to discover exactly who." Alina hesitated only a moment before deciding the time for silence had passed. "Charlotte visited me while you were inspecting the eastern fields 2 weeks ago," she admitted. "She suggested questions might be raised about the legitimacy of my invitation to the ball, and hinted quite clearly that she intended to see those questions raised publicly unless I understood my position was temporary at best." Julian's expression darkened further, though his anger now seemed directed elsewhere entirely. "Charlotte," he said, his voice tight with fury, "of course, I should have suspected as much from the moment these rumors began." "Julian," Alina said carefully, "if these rumors continue, if the courts begin questioning the circumstances of our marriage, what happens to us? To my family?" Julian took her hands in his expression softening even as fierce determination remained clear in his eyes. "I will not allow Charlotte's bitterness to destroy what we have built here," he said firmly. "Whatever this marriage began as, Alina, it has become something I refuse to lose to petty scheming and old resentments. I will handle Charlotte myself." True to his word, Julian departed for town the following morning, and Alina spent the day in anxious uncertainty, pacing the halls of Ravenswood Hall while imagining every possible confrontation unfolding between her husband and the woman determined to destroy their marriage. When Julian finally returned that evening, his expression carried a weary satisfaction that eased some of Alina's fear, though clearly not all of it. "I spoke with Charlotte directly," he said, settling into his familiar chair by the study fire. "I made it quite clear that any further attempts to spread false rumors about you would result in the complete severing of all ties between our families, along with certain financial consequences her family can scarcely afford to bear. She understood the message, I believe, though I do not expect her resentment to disappear entirely." "Will it be enough?" Alina asked, still uncertain. "For now," Julian said, "though I fear this will not be the last time Charlotte attempts to interfere in our lives. She has invested a great deal in the belief that she deserved this position, and people rarely accept such losses gracefully." Alina moved closer, settling onto the arm of his chair, and Julian's hand found hers almost automatically, as though the gesture had become as natural to him as breathing. "Thank you for defending me," she said quietly. "You did not have to." "I believe I did," Julian said, looking up at her with an expression of such open sincerity that Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. "Eleanor, when I began this arrangement, I told myself it was simply a practical solution to an inconvenient problem. I have since learned that was never entirely true, even from the very beginning. I do not know precisely when my feelings toward you shifted from practical tolerance into something considerably deeper, but I know that watching Charlotte attempt to threaten your place in this house filled me with an anger I have not felt in a very long time." Eleanor's heart pounded at his words, hope and caution warring within her chest in equal measure. "Julian," she said softly, "are you saying what I believe you are saying?" "I am saying," Julian replied, rising from his chair so that he stood directly before her, "that I have come to care for you far more deeply than I ever intended to, and that the thought of losing you to Charlotte's schemes or to anything else has become entirely unacceptable to me." Eleanor felt tears gathering at the corners of her eyes, though they were tears born of relief and hope rather than sorrow. "I have come to care for you as well," she admitted, "more than I ever expected to, given how our marriage began." Julian reached up, gently brushing a stray tear from her cheek, his touch tender in a way that contrasted sharply with the cold, calculating man the county had once feared. "Then perhaps," he said quietly, "we owe Charlotte a small debt of gratitude for forcing us both to admit what we had already begun to feel." Eleanor laughed softly through her remaining tears, and for the first time since that fateful waltz had bound them together, she felt genuinely hopeful about the future they were building, brick by careful brick, out of a marriage that had started as nothing more than a cruel game, and was slowly transforming into something neither of them had dared to expect. Charlotte's warning had not been an empty threat, despite Julian's confidence that the matter had been settled. Barely a week after their conversation in the study, Eleanor received an urgent note from her father, requesting she visit the family home as soon as possible. She arrived to find her parents seated in tense silence, a letter spread across the table between them bearing an official seal Eleanor did not recognize. "What has happened?" Eleanor asked, her stomach already tightening with dread. "A formal inquiry," her father said grimly, sliding the letter toward her. "Filed with the county court, questioning the legitimacy of your marriage to the Duke. It claims the invitation you used to attend the ball was fraudulently obtained, and suggests the entire Waltz custom may have been invoked under false circumstances." Eleanor read the letter with growing horror. The accusations were carefully worded, clearly crafted by someone with legal knowledge, suggesting that Eleanor had somehow conspired with her cousin Margaret to obtain the invitation specifically to place herself in Julian's path, thereby manipulating the ancient custom for personal gain. It did not take much imagination to guess who stood behind such a carefully constructed accusation. "Charlotte," Eleanor whispered. "The letter does not name its source," her mother said, "but the timing leaves little doubt." Eleanor returned to Ravenswood Hall immediately, finding Julian in his study poring over estate documents that suddenly seemed far less important than the crisis now threatening everything they had built together. He read the letter twice, his expression growing darker with each line, before setting it down with controlled, deliberate care that somehow frightened Eleanor more than open anger would have. "This is a serious matter," Julian said quietly. "If the court agrees to hear this inquiry, it could delay proceedings for months, during which time our marriage would exist under a cloud of public suspicion. Worse, if the court somehow rules against us, the marriage could be annulled entirely, and your family's debts, already settled through our marriage contract, could potentially be reinstated." "What can we do?" Eleanor asked, fear creeping into her voice despite her attempts to remain calm. "We fight it," Julian said firmly. "I will speak with my solicitor immediately, and we will gather testimony from everyone who witnessed the events of that evening. Margaret's illness can be verified by her physician. The timing of the invitation can be confirmed through household staff who witnessed the exchange." This accusation is built on suspicion and malice, not evidence, and I intend to prove exactly that before the entire county." True to his word, Julian spent the following days working tirelessly alongside his solicitor, gathering statements and evidence to counter the inquiry's claims. Alina found herself drawn into the effort as well, writing to Margaret to request her physician's confirmation of the illness that had prevented her from attending the ball herself, and speaking with household staff who could verify the innocent, last-minute nature of the invitation's exchange. Yet even as they worked to defend their marriage, whispers continued to spread through the county, growing louder and more damaging with each passing day. Alina noticed the change most acutely during her village visits, where families who had once greeted her warmly now offered only careful, distant politeness, clearly uncertain whether associating too closely with a duchess under such public suspicion might reflect poorly upon themselves. The formal hearing was scheduled for the following month, and as the date approached, Alina found herself increasingly anxious, lying awake at night imagining every possible outcome, most of them disastrous. Julian, though outwardly composed, grew increasingly quiet during this period, spending long hours locked away with his solicitor, and Alina began to fear that the weight of this crisis might undo the fragile trust they had only just begun building between them. It was during one particularly difficult evening, as Alina sat alone in the garden among the roses that had come to mean so much to her, that Julian finally found her, his expression carrying an exhaustion that went beyond mere physical tiredness. "I am sorry," he said, settling beside her on the garden bench. "I have been so consumed by preparing our defense that I have neglected to consider how frightening this entire situation must be for you." "I am frightened," Alina admitted. "Not simply for myself, but for you and for everything we have built together. If the court rules against us, Julian, what becomes of you? Your inheritance, your title, everything your family has protected for generations." "None of that matters as much to me as it once did," Julian said quietly, taking her hand in his. "I built walls around my heart for so long, believing they protected me from exactly this kind of vulnerability. And yet here I am, more afraid of losing you than I have ever been of losing anything else in my life, including this entire estate." Alina felt tears rising, though she blinked them back, determined to remain strong for both of them. "We will face this together," she said firmly. "Whatever Charlotte intends, whatever the court decides, we will face it as partners, exactly as we promised each other." The day of the hearing arrived cold and gray, matching the tension that hung over Alina as their carriage approached the county courthouse. Charlotte was already present when they arrived, seated near the front of the courtroom with an expression of carefully composed satisfaction that made Alina's stomach turn with anxious dread. The proceedings began with the reading of the formal accusation, followed by testimony from various witnesses called to speak on the matter. Alina's cousin Margaret, still pale from her lingering illness, testified clearly and firmly about the circumstances of the invitation's exchange, her physician confirming the genuine nature of her sickness on the night in question. Household staff from both the Hartley residence and the ball itself offered corroborating accounts, painting a clear picture of innocent, last-minute circumstances rather than any deliberate scheme. Yet just as the hearing seemed to be turning favorably in Alina's direction, Charlotte's solicitor rose to present a final piece of evidence, a letter he claimed had been written by Alina herself, expressing knowledge of the Waltz custom well before the night of the ball. Alina's heart nearly stopped as the letter was read aloud to the courtroom, the handwriting bearing an unsettling resemblance to her own. "I never wrote that letter," Alina said, rising from her seat, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and outrage. "I have never seen that document before this very moment." The judge studied the letter carefully, then looked toward Alina with an expression of grave consideration. "This is a serious accusation, Your Grace," he said, addressing Julian directly. "Forged correspondence, if proven, would constitute a significant offense in itself, though the immediate concern remains the legitimacy of your marriage." Julian rose beside Alina, his expression calm despite the storm clearly building behind his eyes. "Your Honor, I request an examination of that letter by an independent expert in handwriting analysis. I am confident that a careful examination will reveal clear differences between my wife's true handwriting and whatever forgery has been presented to this court today." The judge agreed to the request, calling for a brief recess while an expert was summoned to examine the disputed letter alongside genuine samples of Alina's handwriting, gathered from her personal correspondence and estate ledgers. The tension during that recess felt unbearable to Alina, who paced the courthouse hallway with Julian's steady presence at her side, his hand never leaving hers throughout the agonizing wait. When the court reconvened, the handwriting expert delivered his findings with careful, measured certainty. The disputed letter, he explained, showed clear inconsistencies in letter formation and stroke pressure compared to Alina's genuine handwriting samples, strongly suggesting the document had been forged by someone attempting to imitate her writing style, though not entirely successfully. A murmur swept through the courtroom, and Alina watched as Charlotte's composed expression finally cracked, panic flashing across her face as the judge turned toward her with narrowed, suspicious eyes. "Lady Winslow," the judge said sternly, "given that this forged evidence appears to have originated from sources close to your own testimony against this marriage, I must ask directly, do you have any knowledge regarding the origins of this fraudulent document?" Charlotte's carefully maintained composure shattered entirely under the weight of the courtroom's attention. "I only wish to see justice served," she said, her voice rising with desperate anger. "Julian was promised to me long before that merchant's daughter ever entered his life. She stole what was rightfully mine, and I merely sought to reclaim it." The courtroom erupted into scandalized whispers, and the judge called for order before addressing Charlotte with cold, formal severity. "Lady Winslow, presenting forged evidence before this court constitutes a serious criminal offense. I have no choice but to refer this matter to further investigation, separate from the inquiry into this marriage, which I now consider entirely without merit." The judge formally dismissed the inquiry against Alina and Julian's marriage, declaring it legitimate and binding in every respect, while Charlotte was escorted from the courtroom under the watchful eyes of the county's legal officials, her schemes finally exposed before the very society she had hoped to impress with her cunning. Alina felt relief wash over her so powerfully that her knees nearly buckled beneath her, and Julian's arm immediately wrapped around her waist, steadying her as they made their way out of the courthouse together, finally free from the shadow of suspicion that had hung over their marriage for weeks. "It is over," Alina breathed, leaning gratefully against her husband as their carriage carried them home. "Truly over." "It is," Julian agreed, pressing a gentle kiss to the top of her head, a gesture so tender that Alina felt tears finally spilling freely down her cheeks, tears of relief rather than fear. "And I believe, Alina, that we have both proven something important today, not only to the court but to ourselves." "What is that?" Alina asked softly. "That whatever challenges attempt to come between us," Julian said, "we are far stronger facing them together than either of us could ever be alone." The weeks that followed the hearing brought a peace to Ravenswood Hall that Alina had not known was possible when she first arrived there as a frightened, unwilling bride. News of Charlotte's disgrace spread quickly through the county, and with it came a quiet shift in how the surrounding families regarded Alina herself. The whispers that had once questioned her legitimacy transformed gradually into admiration for the quiet strength she had shown throughout the entire ordeal, and Alina found herself welcomed into village homes and county gatherings with a warmth she had never expected to earn. Julian, too, seemed transformed by the trial they had weathered together. The careful walls he had spent a lifetime constructing around his heart continued to soften with each passing week, and Alina watched with quiet joy as the cold, calculating Duke everyone once feared gave way to a man capable of genuine laughter, gentle affection, and open vulnerability that he had once believed impossible to show anyone at all. One crisp autumn evening, several months after their wedding, Julian requested that Alina join him in the garden after supper, his manner carrying a nervous energy that Alina found both puzzling and endearing in a man usually so composed. She found him standing beside his mother's roses, now flourishing under Alina's careful attention, the last golden light of sunset casting the entire garden in warm, gentle color. "You wish to see me?" Alina asked, approaching him with curious amusement. "I did," Julian said, turning to face her, and Alina noticed with growing surprise that his hands were not entirely steady. "Alina, I have been thinking a great deal about how our marriage began. A cruel game born from an old family custom and my own desperate need to secure my inheritance. I offered you no true choice that night, and I have carried a measure of guilt about that ever since, despite everything we have since built together." "Julian," Alina said softly, "I have long since forgiven you for the circumstances of our beginning. You know this." "I do know it," Julian said. "And yet forgiveness for the past does not erase the fact that you have never truly been asked, freely and without obligation, whether you wish to remain my wife at all." Alina's heart began to race, uncertain where this conversation was leading, though something in Julian's expression suggested this was not a moment for fear. He reached into his coat and withdrew a small velvet box, and Alina's breath caught entirely as he lowered himself onto one knee before her, right there among his mother's beloved roses. "Alina," Julian said, his voice steady despite the emotion clearly trembling beneath it, "I am not offering you a waltz this time, nor any ancient custom that binds you to me against your will. I am asking you, freely and honestly, as a man who has come to love you more deeply than he ever believed himself capable of loving anyone, whether you would choose me, truly choose me, as your husband, not out of obligation or contract, but out of genuine affection." Tears filled Alina's eyes as she looked down at the man who had once been nothing more than a fearsome stranger, now kneeling before her with his heart laid entirely bare. "Julian Ashcombe," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "I have loved you for longer than I have been willing to admit, even to myself. I choose you. I have always chosen you. From the very first moment, I began to see past the walls you built to protect yourself." Julian rose, slipping a delicate ring onto her finger beside the one he had given her on their wedding day, and pulled her into an embrace that held none of the careful distance that had once defined their relationship. "Thank you," he whispered against her hair, "for seeing something worth loving in a man everyone else had already given up on." "There was always something worth loving there," Alina whispered back. "You simply needed someone patient enough to wait for you to believe it yourself." They remained in the garden long after the sun had fully set, wrapped in each other's arms beneath a sky slowly filling with stars, and Alina understood with quiet and complete certainty that whatever cruel game had first brought them together, what remained between them now was something entirely different. It was a partnership built on honesty, tested by adversity, and strengthened through genuine understanding, the kind of love that grows not from a single dramatic gesture, but from countless small moments of patience, forgiveness, and choice, made again and again, long after the music of that first fateful waltz had faded into memory. In the months that followed, Ravenswood Hall became known throughout the county not for the coldness of its duke, but for the warmth of the household he shared with his wife. Alina continued her charitable work among the villages, expanding it into programs that provided lasting support for struggling families, inspired in part by her own family's earlier hardships. Julian, meanwhile, found himself softened not only in his private life, but in his public dealings as well, earning a reputation for fairness and consideration that stood in stark contrast to the fearsome figure he had once cultivated. Charlotte's schemes, once exposed, resulted in her family's quiet removal from polite society, though Alina found she carried no lingering resentment toward the woman whose jealousy had nearly destroyed everything. In a strange way, Charlotte's desperate attempt to separate them had only proven, beyond any doubt, the strength of what Alina and Julian had built together, a foundation solid enough to withstand even the most calculated betrayal. As winter settled over Ravenswood Hall, bringing with it the first snow of the season, Alina stood once again by her bedroom window, much as she had on that very first night after the ball, when her entire future had felt uncertain and frightening. This time, however, she did not stand alone. Julian's arms wrapped around her from behind, his chin resting gently against the top of her head. As they watched the snow fall silently over the gardens they had both grown to love. "Do you ever think of that first night?" Elinor asked quietly. "The ballroom, the waltz, everything that followed." "Often," Julian admitted. "I think of how terrified you looked, standing there in your cousin's borrowed dress, certain I intended only to humiliate you." "And what do you think now, looking back?" Elinor asked. Julian turned her gently to face him, his eyes filled with a warmth that had once seemed entirely foreign to his careful, guarded nature. "I think," he said softly, "that sometimes the cruelest beginnings lead to the gentlest endings, if two people are willing to be patient enough and brave enough to discover what lies beneath the walls they build to protect themselves." Elinor smiled, rising onto her toes to press a gentle kiss against his lips, and outside their window, the snow continued to fall over Ravenswood Hall, blanketing the gardens in quiet white, much as their own hearts had finally settled into a peace neither of them had believed possible when this story first began, with nothing more than a single waltz and a promise Elinor had once believed was only a cruel and fleeting game. Spring returned to Ravenswood Hall the following year, bringing with it a visitor neither Elinor nor Julian had expected. Edmund Ashcombe, the cousin whose looming inheritance had once forced Julian into his desperate arrangement, arrived unannounced one bright morning, his carriage far less grand than Elinor remembered from the few occasions she had seen him at family gatherings. Julian met him in the entrance hall with guarded politeness, uncertain what business could possibly bring Edmund to their door after so many months of distant silence. "I will not stay long," Edmund said, twisting his hat nervously in his hands, a gesture so unlike the arrogant man Elinor remembered that she found herself softening toward him despite her lingering wariness. "I have come only to offer my congratulations, belated as they are, and to admit that I misjudged you both rather badly." "That is unexpected," Julian said carefully, though he gestured for Edmund to follow them into the study, where a fire chased away the last chill of early spring. Edmund accepted a seat, still fidgeting with his hat, and spoke with an honesty that surprised them both. "I spent the last year believing my fortunes would improve the moment this estate passed to me instead of you," he admitted. "I gambled heavily on that assumption, and lost a great deal in the process, trusting men who promised me quick returns on investments that never existed at all. I find myself now in considerably reduced circumstances, and humbled enough to recognize that perhaps your father's will, cruel as its terms seemed at the time, protected this family from a fate far worse than an unconventional marriage." Elinor exchanged a glance with Julian, reading in his expression the same cautious sympathy she felt herself. "What will you do now?" she asked gently. "I am not entirely certain," Edmund admitted. "I had hoped, though I have little right to ask it, that you might consider allowing me a small position managing one of the estate's outlying properties. Nothing grand. Simply enough to rebuild an honest life, rather than the empty one I have been chasing." Julian considered this for a long moment, and Elinor watched as something like genuine compassion softened his features, a far cry from the calculating coldness that had once defined every decision he made. "I will consider it," Julian said finally, "on the condition that you prove your intentions through honest work before any position is made permanent. I have learned this past year that people are rarely as fixed in their nature as we assume them to be, given the right circumstances and the right patience." Edmund left that afternoon with cautious hope in his eyes, and over the following months he proved himself a diligent and surprisingly capable manager of the small tenant farm Julian assigned to him, slowly rebuilding both his fortune and his character through quiet, steady effort. Elinor found a strange satisfaction in watching this transformation unfold, another small proof that the hardened judgments people once held about each other, including the judgments the entire county had once held about Julian himself, rarely told the whole story. That same spring, Alina discovered she was carrying a child, news that filled Ravenswood Hall with an anticipation unlike anything the old house had known in generations. Julian, who had spent his own childhood shaped by cold expectation and harsh discipline, approached the coming arrival with a determination Alina found deeply moving. Late at night, she often found him standing in the nursery being prepared down the hall from their own chambers, silently studying the space, as though committing to memory every promise he intended to keep toward the child not yet born. "I will not raise our son or daughter the way I was raised," he told Alina one evening, his hand resting gently against the small curve of her growing belly. "I want them to know warmth from the very beginning, not walls they must spend a lifetime learning to dismantle." "They will know it," Alina assured him, covering his hand with her own, "because they will have a father who already understands exactly what he does not wish to repeat, and a mother who intends to remind him of that promise whenever he needs it." Their daughter arrived on a mild autumn morning, nearly 1 year to the day since Alina had first stepped through the doors of Ravenswood Hall as a frightened, unwilling bride. They named her Rose, in quiet honor of the garden that had witnessed so much of their own transformation, and Alina watched with tears of pure joy as Julian held their daughter for the first time, his usually composed expression dissolving into open, unguarded wonder. "She is perfect," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion Alina had once believed him incapable of showing so freely. "She is," Alina agreed, "and she will grow up knowing exactly how loved she is from the very first day of her life." As the years passed, Ravenswood Hall continued to flourish under the partnership Alina and Julian had built together. Alina's charitable work expanded across the entire county, eventually inspiring similar efforts among other noble families who had once dismissed such concerns as beneath their attention. Julian's reputation transformed entirely from the cold, feared Duke of old into a respected and even beloved figure, known throughout the region for his fairness in business dealings and his genuine care for the tenants and villages under his protection. Charlotte Winslow, whose schemes had once nearly destroyed everything Alina and Julian had built, eventually left the county entirely, her family's reputation too damaged to sustain their previous social standing. Alina heard, years later, that Charlotte had married a modest merchant in a distant town, and though Alina felt no particular satisfaction in her former rival's diminished circumstances, she found a quiet sense of closure in knowing that the bitter chapter of Charlotte's interference had finally, truly ended. On the 5th anniversary of that fateful ball, Julian surprised Alina by arranging a small, private gathering in the very ballroom where their story had first begun, now transformed with soft candlelight and quiet music rather than the crowded spectacle of that original evening. He led her onto the dance floor, and as the violins began the same slow waltz they had shared 5 years before, Alina felt the weight of everything that had happened between that first dance and this one, every fear, every challenge, every quiet moment of growing trust and love. "Do you remember what I said to you that first night?" Julian asked softly as they moved together across the floor. "You said one waltz with you would make me your wife," Alina said, smiling up at him. "I believed it was only a cruel game." "It began as one," Julian admitted. "A game born from desperation and old family custom, with little thought given to the woman whose life it would forever change. I am not proud of how carelessly I began this story, Alina, though I have spent every day since trying to make amends for that careless beginning." "You have more than made amends," Alina said, resting her head against his shoulder as they continued their slow, private dance. "You gave me a home when I feared I would only find a cage. You gave me purpose when I feared I would only find emptiness. And you gave me your heart, eventually, when I feared you had none left to give at all." "I gave you all of it," Julian said quietly, "because you were patient enough to wait for me to find it myself, buried beneath years of walls I never believed could come down." As the final notes of the waltz faded into comfortable silence, Julian drew Alina close, resting his forehead gently against hers, the same way he had learned to express affection through small, deliberate gestures rather than grand declarations. "One waltz with me," he murmured, "and you became my wife." But it was countless small moments afterward, Elinor Ashcombe, that made you the truest partner of my heart. Elinor closed her eyes, breathing in the quiet contentment of everything they had built together. From a cruel and unwilling beginning into a love neither of them had believed themselves capable of finding. Outside the tall ballroom windows, the same stars that had watched their very first dance together continued their slow, patient journey across the night sky, silent witnesses to a story that had transformed, against every expectation, from a cruel duke's careless game into the truest and gentlest love story either of them had ever known.